Good evening, everyone. This week's parish is Parish Bahabachukaisai, Tavshin Pei Aleph. But instead of this week's Drasha being on the parish of the week, I'd like to discuss something about the upcoming holiday of Shavuos. And that is, on Shavuos, we read the book of Ruth, which is the story of the convert Ruth and her story. And just to sum it up quickly, the book of Ruth is one of the 24 books of the Tanakh. And the story, in short, is that during the times of the judges, a man named Elimelech left Israel with his family. His two sons married Moabite women. All the family died. And Elimelech's wife, Naomi, returned with her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Arpa, to the land of Israel. Arpa returned to her native land of Moab, which is where they had moved to. Ruth stayed with her mother-in-law and converted. And we read how they were poverty-stricken, and how Ruth went out to glean in the fields, but all the poor would pick up the gleanings. And she landed up in the field of the leader of the Jewish people named Boaz, who was actually a uncle to her deceased husband. It was actually Elimelech's brother. And when he noticed her and he found out who she was, he blessed her for the kindness that she showed her mother-in-law, told her to stay here and glean this field. Then we read how it came about that Boaz decided to marry Ruth. But in the line of family, there was actually I don't know if Boaz was the brother of Elimelech. No, I think Boaz was the nephew of Elimelech. It was a relative. And before Boaz would marry Ruth, there was a closer relative who should have been marrying her. That closer relative did not want to marry her, and Boaz did. And it was from this marriage of Boaz to Ruth that King David came from. That's a very quick synopsis of the story of the book of Ruth. Now, who wrote the book of Ruth? Who wrote it? So the Talmud in Gemara Bava Basra teaches us that the author of the book of Ruth was Shmuel Hanavi, the prophet Samuel. The Medrash asks, what is the purpose of this book? Because it's a story. No prophecy in it. It's not like, let's say, Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, Koheles Ecclesiastes, Eicha, Lamentations, that have a message in it. It's a story. So the question is, why did Shmuel Hanavi feel it necessary to write this book? And eventually, the sages incorporated it into the Tanakh. It's one of the 24 holy scriptures. Why was it so important for them to include it? What is exactly the point of knowing this story? There are many answers given to it, and I will share with you the following. Now, as I mentioned, Ruth is the great-grandmother of David Melech, of King David, which means the entire Davidic dynasty of kings that were meant to be the kings of Israel, and eventually Melech HaMashiach, the King Mashiach, comes from that family. All this comes from Ruth. Now, but there was controversy surrounding Ruth. And the controversy comes really from a very basic question. As I mentioned before, Ruth came from the ancient nation of Moab. The Torah forbids converts from Moab to marry people with an unbroken Jewish lineage. They're not allowed to marry them. They cannot. The Torah says, an Ammonite and a Moabite may not enter into the congregation of Israel. They can convert. They are considered Jews, but they may not marry a born Jew. I mean, they might marry. They can marry a convert. They cannot marry, though, someone who has an unbroken Jewish lineage. Whether they can marry a second generation convert, I'm not sure. But the point is that they are restricted in who they can marry. So the question obviously becomes, how could Ruth, who was a Moabite convert, how could she marry Boaz, who was someone that was always Jewish? And the answer is because the rule is that the Torah says, Lo yave amayni umayavi b'kal Hashem, an Ammonite and a Moabite may not enter into the congregation of Hashem. And the sages understand that the prohibition is Moavi, which literally means a male Moabite, does not include a female Moabite. That is the tradition that we have. That is the way the sages interpreted this verse and this prohibition. And that is the halacha, that a Moabite convert, the only Moabite convert that cannot marry it's called a born Jew, is a male Moabite convert, but a female may. So if you read the Torah, and then you read the Torah on its own, you would read La Yavo Amoni Ma'avi B'Kal Hashem. It's in masculine form, but actually very often when we refer to both men and women together, we use the masculine form. But nonetheless, here, the sages interpreted that it means literally following the literal meaning of Moavi, because a female would be Moavis. The fact that it says Moavi means it is only a male Moabite convert that cannot marry someone born a born Jew, while a female may. And therefore, Ruth was able to marry Boaz. Okay. Now, I'm using her name Ruth as it is in Hebrew. In English, it's Ruth. Okay. Now, so that is a certain question that one has to ask when reading this story, and that's the answer. But it wasn't as simple as that. Historically, it was not that simple. It wasn't that accepted, that interpretation. And actually, we find that in two places. We find it actually in the book of Ruth itself. I mentioned before that when Boaz wanted to marry Ruth, he had to ask another relative first, who was a closer relative, if he would marry her. And he said no. Pen ashchis es nachalasi, lest I destroy my heritage, my inheritance. Which the commentaries explain means that what he meant to say was, I don't want to destroy my children. Meaning, if I marry her, she's a Moabite convert. If I marry her, and I'm not permitted to marry her, so then my children will be considered blemished. If there's a person who is forbidden to marry a person, even if it's not one of a close relative, but if the Torah prohibits you to marry someone, the Torah prohibits us to marry a Egyptian convert for the first 3 generations. After 3 generations, they can marry anybody. But for the first 3 generations, they cannot marry someone who's born Jewish. If they do, and the child that's born, the child is not a mamzer, but the child is considered blemished, spiritually blemished. And this relative, who actually is nameless, his name isn't even mentioned in the book of Ruth, they said, I don't want that to happen to my children. And therefore, he wouldn't marry her. Boaz, on the other hand, said, no, you're incorrect. The Torah's prohibition is on a male, not on a female. And the Talmud actually says that he publicly went in front of 10 people and made this very public, that he's marrying her because there is no problem, the fact that she's a Moabite convert, because the Torah's prohibition is only on the men, not on the women. But you see that the issue, right? You see that he didn't want to marry her because of that. Boaz, who actually was leader of the Jewish people, went up and said, the halacha is you can marry her. But he didn't want to marry her because of that. Later on in history, we find again the problem comes up. And this comes up in a very interesting story. We're all familiar with the story of David and Goliath, or as we say, David and Goliath, which is from the book of Shmuel, Aleph, Samuel 1, about how the first king of the Jewish people, King Saul, was the Jewish people were always having to deal with the Philistines. And the Philistines had a soldier named Goliath, or a general named Goliath, who was a very strong, giant, powerful person who scared the Jewish people out of their wits. They didn't know how to deal with him. It was David on the king. It was David, the young David, who came to the battlefield, and without getting to all the details of the story, took on Goliath. Goliath is the name in the Tanakh, in the book of Shmuel, and he killed him. And he came back with Goliath's head. So when we read this story in the book of Shmuel, when this happens, so King Shaul, who was present, turns to his general Avner, and he says, Ben Mizahanar, who is the son, Ben Mizahanar, who this young lad, who is the son of? Now the Talmud in the Talmud in Gemara Yavamis, Daf Ayin Vav Amid Beis 66b, asked the following question. What kind of question was that? Shaul knew who he was. As a matter of fact, David was actually brought to play his lyre for Shaul, because Shaul was having a difficult time. He was in a very depressed mood, in a troubled mood. And therefore they hired David to play his music for him, to calm him down. So he knew who David was. So why did he ask this question? Who is he the son of? Okay. So the Gemara answers, it wasn't about David, because he didn't say, who is this? He said, Ben Mizah, who is he the son of? But again, the Gemara is not satisfied with that, because he knew who David's father was. David's father was Yishai. Shaul knew Yishai. And therefore the question was, what was he asking? So the Gemara says what he really was asking was like this. You know, part of the story of King Shaul is a very difficult one, because we know that King Shaul considered David as someone trying to take the kingdom away from him, and he tried to kill David for it, and David had to run away. And although, and part of the problem is that earlier, when King Shaul had failed to destroy the nation of Amalek, so the prophet Shmuel told him, you're going to lose the kingdom. The kingdom's going to leave your family. And this was something that troubled Shaul Melech very much. So when he saw that David, out of everyone, defeated Shaul, which means he basically acted royal, because it was really kind of this kind of way that he carried himself, and he was able to fight and everything. He was showing signs of monarchy, signs of being a king. So Shaul was getting nervous. Could this be the person who's going to replace me, who's going to knock me off of the throne? And again, he wasn't going to usurp it. The point was that at a certain point of time, the monarchy would leave Shaul and go completely over to David and his dynasty. And at this point of time, Shaul Melech didn't know this, but the prophet Shmuel had anointed David as the future king already. So the question that Shaul Melech had when he said, who is he the son of, is he wanted to know like this. And again, this is kind of makes it a little difficult to understand what was Shaul thinking, you know, especially after Shmuel had told him he's going to lose the kingdom, you know. But there's also, everybody knew that the tribe of Yehuda, kings were to come from the tribe of Yehuda. How does that work exactly with the fact that Shaul was not from the tribe of Yehuda? How could the two things have worked together? We're not going to go into that right now. But there was a tradition and understanding that kings would come from Yehuda, from the tribe of Yehuda. Now, it was also known that they would come. It was that Yehuda had two sons. Actually, had three, but his last two were Peretz and Zarach. And it was known that from Peretz would come kings, and from Zarach would come distinguished people, but not kings. So when Shaul asks Avner, who is the father of David, he wants to know, is David from the family of Peretz and perhaps destined for the monarchy, or is he from Zarach and not destined for the monarchy? Okay, that was the question that he asked. That was how the Gemara says that's what he was asking. Now, Avner's response was, I don't know. Then again, it says that okay. So he said, I don't know. And then again, it says that King Shaul asked, who is the father of this Elam, of this young lad? So the Gemara tells us that without the Tanakh mentioning this, there was a lot going on here. So after David HaMelech asked, what family, after Shaul HaMelech, after King Shaul asked, what family does he come from? King Shaul had an advisor. His name was Doeg Hadomi. He was actually a great Torah scholar. He was the head of the Sanhedrin. And Doeg turned to both Shaul and to Avner and said, you want to know what family he comes from? I got a bigger problem. I don't even know if his lineage is clean. I don't even know if he's not considered unblemished. I think he's blemished, and he can't be king then. Why is he blemished? Because he comes from Ruth, the Moabite. And the Torah says, you're not allowed to marry a Moabite convert. That means he's born from a forbidden marriage. He's blemished. His lineage is blemished. He can't be king. So Avner responded, what do you mean? The Torah says, Lo yavai Ammoni u'Moavi. It says a Moabite and Ammonite cannot enter the congregation. And we know that this law, or that this prohibition only applies to a Moabite and to a Moavi, not to a Moabis, to a male Moabite and not to a female. Okay. The Torah says, basically, Avner said to him, the Torah says, Layava Moavi. Moavi is masculine. And from that, we know that it was only a prohibition on the men, not on the women. So Doeg said to him, if you're deriving it because of that wording, then I'm going to show you a different example where we don't derive, where we don't interpret like that. As I mentioned before, there's a prohibition of a Mitzri. Torah says, Lo yavai Mitzri b'kal Hashem. An Egyptian convert cannot come into the congregation until after a certain amount of time. It says there Mitzri. It doesn't say Mitzris. Mitzri literally is the male, not the female. Are you going to tell me there also that a female Egyptian convert can marry somebody right away? We know that's not the halacha. So what's the difference? So Avner answered, wait a minute. In the case of the prohibition of a Moabite, the Torah gives us a reason as to why they cannot enter marry someone born Jewish. And that's because the Torah says, when the Jews were traveling through the desert, the Moabites didn't offer them food and drink as they were passing by. And said Avner, who's responsible to do that? Who's responsible to go out and give food and drink? The men. The women don't go out and do that. So if the Torah tells us the reason they may not marry is because they didn't bring out food and drink to the Jewish people in the desert, that doesn't apply to women, that applies to the men. So Doeg responded, that's not such a question. You know why? Only the men went, if that's going to be the point, if you're going to tell me that based on the reason you want to make that argument, I'll counter that argument. You know what they could have done? The men could have done and taken care of the men, and the women could have gone and taken care of the women. Why didn't they do that? Okay, you want to tell me the women don't go out and interact with the men. They could have interacted with the women. So you're telling me, based on the reason the Torah gives, it could apply to women also. Why didn't the women go out and share food with the women? And after that, Avner didn't have what to say, didn't have a response. Now the Gemara does respond and say that the answer at the end, because the halacha is that a Moabite woman can marry. The answer to that question would be that nonetheless, the women didn't go out. It wasn't the practice for women to go out like that. But again, that answer apparently wasn't the strongest answer. And therefore, Avner didn't really know where to go, which way to go. He was stuck. So the Gemara says that Shaul was stuck too. Shaul understood where Avner was coming from, but he knew how Doeg responded. So they were stuck now. So Shaul told Doeg, go to the yeshiva, go to the study hall, go to where the scholars are, and ask this question. So the Gemara says that they went through the entire discussion. Doeg comes, brings up this question. The answer only applies to a man, not to a woman. And Doeg asks them the question that he asked Avner. They respond. Doeg answers back, and they're stuck. And Doeg actually was ready to publicly announce and say that this young man, David, is right. He's a Moabite convert, and he can't marry anybody that's born Jewish. He can't do it because it goes down through all the descendants. The Gemara says that one of the scholars, whose name was Masa ben Yeser, got up and he said, whoever does not listen to the following law that I'm about to state shall be run through with a sword. I have a tradition from the Prophet Shmuel. The prohibition only applies to men, not to women. That is tradition that I have from Shmuel the prophet. That ended the conversation. But you see that this was something that there was a question, there was controversy about it in the times of Rus, and later on the controversy erupted again until it was settled. But there was controversy around it. Therefore, the commentaries say that actually this is the reason why Shmuel wrote the book of Rus. He wrote the book of Rus because he wanted to make it very public and very well known that David HaMelech is not a Moabite convert. He has no problem of marrying into the Jewish people. You know, I really should correct myself. Before I said descendants are blemished. You know why they're blemished? They're blemished because if you come from a Moabite convert who's not allowed to be married, you have the same status. And therefore, you can't marry into the Jewish people. Can't be the king of the Jewish people then. If that's what you are. So Shmuel Hanavi, Shmuel the prophet, wrote the book of Rus to make it clear that look, you know, if you're going to start asking questions about David HaMelech's lineage, look, this is the story. Boaz was the leader of the Jewish people of his time, and he married her. Why? Because of the fact that it only applies to male and not to female. And this is a reason why I can understand as to why it was incorporated in the Tanakh. Because we want to make sure it's clear to people that David HaMelech, the king, that the Davidic dynasty is clean. And not only is it clean, and it means this is the future, this is our future. Mashiach comes from David HaMelech. No one should start questioning, well, what do you mean? It's a Moabite convert. He's a Moabite convert. He's a Moabite. The answer is no. The prohibition only applies to women, not to men, and therefore there is no problem with David HaMelech whatsoever. That's why Shmuel wrote this sefer. You know, basically it has his stamp of approval if he wrote it. But again, when you read the story, you know, Boaz was clearly the leader. He was the one in charge. He was the leader of the Jewish people. He said, no, he should be married. Shmuel put this book together to show that it's correct. He didn't write it in order to go ahead and blemish David. He wasn't doing that. That would be undermining everything that he did in the entire future of the Jewish people. That's not what he was doing. He was trying to say that David HaMelech is kosher. There's no problems with him. So therefore, we now have an answer, as many of the commentaries say, that was the purpose of writing this story. It's a touching story. It's a nice story. But what's the point of it? The point of it is to verify that the lineage of David HaMelech is clean. He is 100% Jewish without any kind of question about his lineage, about his ability to marry to the Jewish people, and therefore he as king in his dynasty. There is no question about it, and there's no question about Mashiach. Okay, so that's an interesting answer as to what the purpose of the book of Rus is. Question is, why do we read it on Shavuos? And to answer that, let's go back to the story and ask a question, a serious question. It's really very hard to understand. You know, we see this back and forth between, you know, everybody in Doeg. You know, does it apply to a man and to a woman? Doeg asks his questions. Everybody's stumped until Ben Yasser says, I received this from Shmuel. It only means a male, not a female. I mean, what was going on? I mean, Boaz, felt that way because he married her. And Doeg still questioned it. So he still questioned it. And he felt had a right to question it. And people didn't know what to do. Amos ben Yasser says, but Shmuel said it. Shmuel said this halacha, that it only applies to men, not to women. What does that make it better? Why would that be convincing more than the fact that Boaz did it? Than the fact that even everybody assumed that's the way it was until Doeg asked his questions. So what happens now? Because this is what Shmuel said. Doeg's allowed his questions. How were the questions answered? So Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, of blessed memory, Rabbi Soloveitchik's uncle, he answered in the following way. We know that Torah has, call it, two parts. Torah Shebachsav, the written law, and Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. The oral law consists of two things. It consists of the methodology of deriving from the words of the Torah that which is not explicitly stated in the Torah. And that methodology was passed on. Wait 1 second. There's the methodology. And then there is what's called halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Laws that were given to Moshe at Sinai, which means there's no derivation for them from the Torah. They were given straight from God to Moshe. This is the law. And Moshe passed it on. The methodology of interpreting the Torah, which is given to the sages, that also was passed on at Sinai to Moshe. But you've got rules, you've got laws, you've got details of laws that are not mentioned in the Torah, but they are derived from the methodology given to derive them from the words of the Torah. Those things derived are considered Torah law, just like the written Torah law. And then you have the oral law that, again, interprets the Torah, helps us understand the Torah, gives us more details. But there's no derivation for them from the Torah. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's a law passed down from God to Moshe. God said, this is the law. But it's not based on any kind of derivation. It's based on God told Moshe, and Moshe passed it on. There is a very big difference between these two parts of the oral law. Now, again, it's very important to know, and we're going to get back to this, that, some people don't know better, and they only think that Torah is the 5 books of Moses and maybe the other books of the Tanakh. And oral law is just, the rabbis made it up. There is a part of oral law is typically studied when we study Mishnah, we study Talmud, and part of Mishnah and Talmud is rabbinic law, are the laws that were instituted by the rabbis that are not about deriving them from the Torah, giving them Torah status. But what people don't realize is that there's a part of Talmud, Mishnah and Talmud, there's a part of the Torah that's not written, but has the same status and level of the written law, and that's called Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. Now, as we said, there are two parts of the Torah, of the oral law. When we talk about things that are derived from the Torah, there's a power given to the ancient sages of Israel, that they have the power to derive from the wording of the Torah. It's their wisdom, and they apply the methodology with their wisdom to derive. Were there differences of opinion about it? There were differences of opinion. There's actually a rule that, let's say there was a generation of sages that interpreted Torah one way, based on a methodology. If a later generation of sages, who are greater in number and in wisdom, change that, they can change that. Whether we're talking about rabbinic enactments, or we're talking about how the rabbis interpreted the Torah, again, using the methodology that was given to them by the Torah. But again, it could be one generation is going to interpret in one way, another generation could change it again if they are worthy of changing it, but they could change it. When you're dealing with halacha l'Moshe Sinai, the ones that have nothing to do with derivation, it's what God had passed down to Moshe, to pass on to the Jewish people, There's no changing that. There's no way to change that. That comes from God to Moshe. There's no changing it. So there's a very big difference between the two. Therefore, Reb Soloveitchik, who's known as the Brisker Rav, explained in the following. Originally, the understanding of this law of that it's Mo'avi v'lo Mo'avis, it only applies to a male Moabite, not to a female Moabite. That originally that was understood to be a derivation from the words of the Torah. And because it was what the rabbis derived from the Torah, Doeg had the power to change it. If he asked the strong enough questions to be able to refute it, and apparently he was worthy enough to do that, then things can change. So Doeg asked his questions. No one was able to answer it. There was a chance that things were going to be changed. What Amasa ben Yeser did was, what he said that I have this as a tradition from Shmuel. He wasn't saying this is how Shmuel interpreted the Torah, but rather Shmuel passed on that this law, this distinction between men and women, is not about a derivation from the Torah. It's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's a law passed down from God to Moshe. That's where we know it from. You know where we know tefillin are meant to be black, are black? Halacha l'Moshe miSinai, because that's what God told Moshe to tell the Jewish people. You can't change that. Amasa ben Yeser was saying, I have a tradition from Shmuel means I received the oral law that says that the distinction between a Moabite man and a Moabite woman, and when they convert, can they marry a born Jewish person? That is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. That's not a derivation from the Torah. That is a distinction, an interpretation of the Torah passed down that Hashem gave Moshe, and that you can't change. That you cannot change. That is what Amasa ben Yeser was saying. The Brisker Rav had a different question. We mentioned before, the closer relative didn't want to marry Ruth. Why? Lest I affect my children. Why was he only concerned about his children? Why wasn't he concerned about himself? If the law applies that the prohibition to marry a Moabite applies to Moabite women, even after they convert, then he should have said, I'm not marrying her because I can't marry her. According to the way I understand, I'm not allowed to marry her. Why is he talking about his kids? So the Brisker Rav explained, because this person, this closer relative, he knew that during that period of time, the sages interpreted that the distinction between the Moabite men and the Moabite women. He knew that at that point of time was that distinction. So he'd be allowed to marry her, but he was concerned what happens in the future if things change. Because understanding that this was, understanding that this was a derivation of the Torah, it could change. If it changes, his descendants are going to get messed up. That's what Doeg wanted to do to David. And therefore he said, I'm not getting involved. And that wasn't what Boaz was following. But at the end of the day, the reason why there is no more controversy, the reason why the controversy was settled was because Amasa ben Yeser said the distinction between Moabite men and Moabite women is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's a law passed down from God to Moshe, and that can never change. Which means that, again, the fact that we don't question the lineage of King David is based on Torah Shebaal Peh, based on the oral law. And therefore, the reason why, a suggested explanation as to why we read Ruth on Shavuos is because being that the whole story of Ruth at the end of the day is about the lineage of David HaMelech. The lineage of David HaMelech is settled by halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It's settled by oral law, by the law that was passed down from God to Moshe and not written, but to remain oral. It's the oral law that really now defines, that settled why David HaMelech's lineage is unblemished, it's fine. and he's worthy of being the king of the Jewish people, and Mashiach is worthy of redeeming us, it's all because of the oral law, Torah Shebaal Peh. And Torah Shebaal Peh itself, it later on in Jewish history was challenged. In the times of the sages of the Mishnah, they developed a group of people called the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, I think that's the way it's pronounced. And they didn't believe in the oral law. And they became very powerful, and they made lots of trouble within the Jewish people amongst those who were truly observant of the Torah, because the Torah is the written and the oral. They wanted to abandon the oral and just interpret the way they wanted to interpret. And they were very powerful, and they made lots of problems for the Jewish people. By reading the book of Ruth on Shavuos, on the holiday of the giving of the Torah, we're trying to stress that on Shavuos we were given the written law. I mean, that's obvious. Given the Ten Commandments, that's the written law. But when the Torah was given, it was given as the written and the oral. They're both Torah. One is no better than the other. They're both Torah. As a matter of fact, without the oral law, we wouldn't be able to understand what the written law is telling us. In order to stress the importance of the oral law, we read the book of Ruth on Shavuos. Shavuos is when we celebrate the giving of the Torah, and we want to stress the importance of the oral law as Torah. We read the book of Ruth, because the book of Ruth is all about the lineage of King of David HaMelech. And that lineage could never have been proven appropriate without Torah Sheba'al, without the oral law. So the reason why, again, so to sum it up, the book of Ruth is about clarifying and putting to rest any question of David HaMelech's lineage. The reason David HaMelech's lineage was no question, all the questions were put to rest were because of the oral law. And therefore, read it on Shavuos, when we receive the Torah, to stress the importance and how the importance of the Torah law, and how essential Torah law is, how essential the oral law is to Torah, and how essential oral law is to our future. Because without the Torah law settling the question about David HaMelech, we wouldn't have Mashiach. So to stress how essential the oral law is to Torah, we read the book of Ruth on the holiday of celebrating the giving of the Torah. Have a wonderful evening, a wonderful Shabbos.